Today's topic is all about writing dialogue. If you have 5 minutes, I have 5 tips for making your dialogue better, no matter what kind of writing you're doing. Whenever a writer tackles dialogue in any piece of writing, the objective is to make it compelling and relatable. Dialogue is one of those things that brings characters to life on the page. And dialogue is not used just in fiction. If you're writing nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, you often have characters in your writing. If you're writing memoir, if you're writing biography, if you're writing profile pieces, magazine or blog piece, these all have characters, and characters speak, and it is speaking that gives life to the characters. The only type of writing that I can think of where dialogue doesn't play a role, generally speaking, is in academic writing. So if you're strictly an academic writer, this might not be that useful for you. However, you might find it interesting. I've been writing dialogue since the genesis of my own writing career back in the 1980s. That's a long time ago. When I started my career as a health and medical writer, I wrote, among other things, profiles for medical journals and medical magazines. And so whenever you're profiling an individual, there will always be a certain amount of dialogue. Of course, I wrote memoir, which I've talked about before, and I've recently been writing fiction. So writing dialogue's been really important to me. Now, a while back, I did a video on how to punctuate dialogue, which is the sort of the technical aspects of writing dialogue. But today's focus is on making that dialogue sparkle. How do you actually put the words together to make it sparkle? But you can go back to episode number 78 and see how to punctuate it when you get to that. Okay, let's talk about the tips. Tip number 1, make every piece of dialogue purposeful. This is tip number 1. It's also the most important one. Everything that comes out of a character's mouth on the page should be purposeful. There should be a reason for it. There should be no dialogue there that's not important. It needs to serve a purpose in your story. So what are some of those purposes? Well, dialogue can reveal character traits. Dialogue can advance the plot. Dialogue can provide information to the reader. Dialogue can also help to build tension in a story. So those are the main purposes of dialogue, and if you have a scene which consists of mostly dialogue and it doesn't have any one of those purposes, then you probably need to cut the scene. You don't need any kind of filler scenes where people say things like, "Hi, how are you? I'm great, how are you? Not so good, how are you doing? How's the day going?" All of that stuff is just filler. Just leave out the entire scene if that's all the characters have to say to one another. Tip number 2. Create dialogue that shows character individuality and voice. This is the second most important one. Your dialogue should be specific to an individual character. Now here's what I mean by that. You need to think about a character's background, personality, motivations, all of those things whenever they're speaking. Whenever an individual character is speaking, it should come through that character's voice. Sometimes they use unique speech patterns, for example. Someone whose first language isn't English, for example, might have a different speech pattern to someone who has grown up with English as a first language. I think about many characters in my novels who were French originally, and the way that the words are sometimes ordered can be different even when that character is speaking English. Of course, you need to know a bit about the other language in order for that to happen. I happen to know a fair bit about French, so I know the order of the words is different than in English, so that when they are speaking English, sometimes they would use the words in the wrong order. That's characteristic of an individual character in your book. Now, for example, if your character is a 14-year-old girl, that character, when she's speaking, shouldn't sound the same as her 55-year-old teacher. Their speech patterns will be different, their personalities will be different, their motivations are different. Make sure it's there in their speech. Tip number 3, consider subtext and the nuance of dialogue. One of the things you probably know for sure is that when you are having a conversation in real life with somebody, there are often underlying meanings to what's being said, more so than just the words. That's the subtext, what's going on underneath the surface. Sometimes there are unspoken thoughts. There are feelings that people have that they don't necessarily express in the words that they're saying, but it comes across when you're writing it as the writer. You need to understand what's going on under the surface when you're writing those words. Characters sometimes say one thing when they mean another thing, and that can lead to tension and conflict. If you're skillful at doing this, you can create really compelling characters that readers really want to get to know better. And there are other things like facial expressions and body language which also contribute to it, so that needs to be included as part of the dialogue. Tip number 4, use the old show, don't tell approach, even in writing dialogue. Now, you've heard this before when people tell you the great piece of advice for writing is that you show people what's going on rather than tell them what's going on. And the same thing is kind of true when you're writing dialogue. Dialogue is often a very good way for characters to show their emotions. And there is related to the tip before this in terms of facial expressions and body language, etc. That is part of this as well, but it needs to be considered very specifically. Often you're going to use facial expressions, you're going to use gestures, your description of a gesture, what the speaker is doing while speaking, that are going to convey a certain amount of nuance and subtext to what you're doing, to what they're saying. All of this is going to make your dialogue more dynamic. Tip number 5, use realistic and concise language. Of course, dialogue does need to reflect normal, regular speech patterns of individuals. But you need to be very careful of so much reflecting what we really say in life that you need to go back to tip number 1, where I talked about the dialogue being purposeful and leaving out stuff that's not necessary. So it needs to be more concise. Even though you want it to be realistic, it needs to be more concise than our regular rambling conversations that we might have with somebody that we run into on the street, or even that you start off a conversation with someone. You need to be more concise about it. If they're trying to get to the point, they need to get to the point even faster than you would in real life. Make sure your characters don't ramble. Also, though, make sure you don't take out so many of the details that you let go of authenticity. So there needs to be a certain amount of authenticity. So those are the 5 tips, but I want to suggest to you that one of the ways to improve your dialogue the best is to read your dialogue out loud. Listen to it, because people hear within their inner ear. The readers are going to listen to the dialogue as much as they are going to see that dialogue. So read it out loud. Does it sound like the character? Can you tell whose voice it is? Every character's voice should be a little different. Yes, we use dialogue tags like John said and Mary said, but when you're not really sure as things move along quickly in conversation. But if your characters are distinct enough, the reader is going to be able to figure out who's speaking just because of how they're saying what they're saying. And that's the hallmark of really good dialogue writing. One of the ways to make your dialogue even better is to pay attention to how people speak. It doesn't matter where you are, if you're on the subway, on a bus, on a plane, sitting in a departure lounge, waiting for your airplane, sitting in your doctor's waiting room, walking down the street, at a restaurant, overhearing people. Listen to people's dialogue. Listen to what they're saying. Keep a notebook. And those little snippets of conversation and the way people are saying things are going to be very helpful to you as you write your dialogue. Happy writing.
Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills. 5 tips at a time.